I showed up to the Mallister Ranch with $47 in my account, a truck that wheezed like a dying animal, and zero plans beyond surviving the next 2 weeks. I wasn't looking for love, I wasn't looking for meaning, I was looking for a paycheck, and what I found instead would completely destroy every wall I'd spent my entire life building brick by brick, since I was old enough to understand that some things about me were better left buried. And the second my boots hit that gravel and kicked up a cloud of red dust, a man stepped out of the barn's shadow like he'd been waiting there specifically for me, broad-shouldered, built like someone who'd never once taken a shortcut in his life, faded jeans, leather gloves shoved in his back pocket, a sweat-stained Stetson pulled low over eyes so sharp they felt like they could read your mail before you opened it, and he said in a voice that sounded like gravel being dragged across old wood, "You the one asking about work?" And I said yeah, and he stuck out his hand and said, "Name's Wade. I run things here, you show up on time, do what's asked, keep your drama to yourself, we'll get along fine." And his grip was exactly as strong as I expected, but what I did not expect, what I was absolutely not prepared for, was the way he held on for just one beat too long, and the way his eyes didn't move from mine like he was looking for something underneath the surface. Something I'd spent years making sure nobody could find, and I pulled back and gave him a polite nod and told myself it meant nothing, told myself I was just tired from the drive, told myself the flutter in my chest was just nerves about the job, but I already knew, somewhere deep down in the part of me I never let speak, I already knew that was a lie. And that first night I lay in bunk 3 of the workers' cabin staring at a water-stained ceiling, while crickets screamed outside loud enough to rattle your skull. And I was just about to pull on a clean shirt when I saw a shadow pass the cabin window, just a glimpse, gone in an instant, no knock, no word, just the hush of the night breeze, and I told myself it was nothing, but my heart was pounding like I'd run a mile. And I didn't sleep for hours because I kept replaying the way his hand had lingered, the way that silence between us felt less like distance and more like a deliberate choice, like 2 people standing on opposite sides of a door that neither one of them had the courage to open yet. And I want you to understand something about me before we go any further. I had spent my entire life getting very good at not wanting things I wasn't supposed to want. I grew up in a town where you learned real fast that certain feelings were better swallowed whole than ever spoken out loud, where you kept your eyes from lingering too long and your voice perfectly even and your walk exactly straight. And I had done that so well for so long that I'd almost convinced myself the wanting wasn't even real, that it was just noise, static, something to be tuned out. But then there was Wade, everywhere always. If I was up at 5 a.m. to muck stalls, he was already there with a thermos like he'd never gone to sleep. If I was feeding the horses, I'd hear his boots on the dirt before I ever saw him, always offering some quiet piece of advice. "Don't stand behind that one, she's got a temper. Try humming when you approach," calms him down. And I started wondering if this man ever actually slept, or if he just materialized wherever I happened to be. Like some dust-covered ghost with sharp eyes, and a voice I could not stop hearing in my head long after he'd walked away. And branding day came brutal and hot, air thick with smoke and the sound of scared calves, and I kept my head down and did the work, let the heat and the repetition drown everything out. But every single time I looked up, Wade was there, arms crossed, eyes on me, that completely unreadable expression on his face. And when I finally got a clean tag on a stubborn calf that had been fighting me for 10 minutes straight, he said low and almost amused, "Good job, kid." And I felt it in my spine. That's the only way I can describe it. It hit me somewhere I hadn't let anything reach in years, and I started noticing things I had absolutely no business noticing. The way he cleaned his knife with a rag after a long day, the veins on his forearms visible even under the dust. The way he adjusted his belt without a second thought, completely unaware that I was standing 10 feet away coming completely undone. And one evening I was rinsing off at the pump behind the stables, shirt off, jeans rolled to my calves, hands going numb in the cold water, the sky burning orange and red above the tree line, and I looked up mid-splash and froze completely because Wade was standing in the barn's open doorway, arms braced on the frame, just watching. Not like someone caught doing something wrong, not even with any shame about it, just watching, steady, calm, and I stared back with my heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my ears, water running down my arms, and he held my gaze for what felt like a full minute before he lit a cigarette. The flame briefly outlining his face in the dim evening light, gave me a single slow nod, and stepped back into the barn, and I stood at that pump for a long time after he was gone. Water still running over my hands, trying to figure out what had just happened to me and why I didn't want it to stop. And the next morning at breakfast I leaned toward Tommy, youngest hand on the ranch, always chewing something, always whistling, and I asked as casually as I could manage, "Wade always watch people this much?" Tommy raised one eyebrow slow and knowing and said with a smirk, "He likes to keep his workers close, especially the quiet ones." And I pretended I didn't understand what that meant even though every single cell in my body understood exactly what that meant. And 3 weeks into the job Wade caught me by the arm behind the equipment shed, out of earshot and out of sight. And I want to be clear that his grip was not rough. It was just firm, certain, like a man who didn't waste motion. And he looked me straight in the face and said, "You're good with your hands, you work hard, don't complain, show up early." And I couldn't tell if he was about to compliment me or warn me, and then he said, "I want to offer you something." And I swallowed hard and said, "Okay," and he said, "I'll double your pay if you spend the night in my room." And it hit me like a bucket of ice water, those words. They were blunt and transactional, and they made something in me go cold and then immediately hot with anger. And I said, "You trying to buy me Wade?" And he didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't look away, just said low and steady, "No, I'm trying to be honest with you. I know what I want and I'm not going to play games about it." And he stepped just slightly closer, voice softer. "You don't owe me anything, I don't expect you to say yes. I'm not pushing, I'm just tired of pretending I don't see you." And I turned and walked away without a single word because I was angry, genuinely angry. But the problem, the thing that kept me awake that entire night staring at the cracked ceiling of the bunkhouse with the fan clicking overhead, was that underneath the anger there was something else, something heavier, because he hadn't been leering, he hadn't been grinning. His eyes hadn't held just lust, there was loneliness in there, something deeper than want, something I recognized because I had been carrying it myself for longer than I could remember. And I lay there on that cot thinking about my bank account sitting barely above zero, and the bills I hadn't paid, and the way a person's hand on your back can quiet every storm inside you, and how long it had been since anyone had touched me like I was something worth touching. And I thought about the way Wade had looked at me, not like I was broken, not like I was wrong, but like he was waiting for me to stop running. And the next evening after dinner, I found myself standing outside his door with my knuckles raised and my whole body shaking. And I knocked, and he opened it without hesitation, didn't speak, didn't smile, just stepped back and held the door wide, and I walked in, and his room was simple. A bed, a lamp, boots by the door. The faint scent of saddle leather and wood smoke clinging to the walls, a fan humming lazy in the corner, and he closed the door behind me and didn't move any closer, just sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head tilted slightly, and said quietly, "You don't owe me anything, not even after tonight." And that hit harder than the offer had, because he meant it. There was no script, no angle, no manipulation, just him and me in a small room with the truth between us. And I walked over slowly and sat beside him, our knees brushing, my heart so loud I was certain he could hear it. And he looked at me then, really looked. And I nodded once, barely, and that was all it took. And he reached for my hand, not my belt, not my chest, my hand, his fingers rough and calloused, wrapping around mine like they'd been waiting there, and we lay down side by side, clothes still on, breathing the same air, and minutes passed, then hours, and eventually he pulled me closer. His arm slipping around my waist, my back against his chest, and we didn't speak, we didn't need to, because the heat between us wasn't frantic or desperate, it was slow and careful, like two people terrified of breaking something neither of them had ever been given before. And I turned toward him in the dark, our faces inches apart, and he pressed his forehead to mine. And for the first time in longer than I could count, I let someone actually see me, not just my body. Not just the surface, but the part of me I'd hidden so deep I'd almost hidden it from myself. And the next morning I slipped out before the light fully broke, pulled on my jeans, reached for my boots, my shirt crumpled near the wall, everything feeling too loud, the fabric, the floorboards, even my own breath. And I stood to leave and heard his voice behind me, rougher than usual but completely calm, "You running?" And I froze with my hand on the door and said no, and slipped out anyway. And for the next 3 days I took every early shift available, cleaned the east stables nobody wanted because they backed up to the swampy creek, skipped the mess hall and ate peanut butter sandwiches alone under the sycamore tree. And Wade didn't come after me, didn't call me out, didn't make a single scene, but I felt his eyes on me every time I moved across that ranch. When I brought in the hay truck, he was leaning on the railing watching. When I brushed the horses at dusk, I felt his gaze on my back before I even turned. And when we passed each other in the narrow hallway by the supply shed, his hand brushed mine, just briefly, not an accident. And every single time he looked at me the same way, softer, patient, like something had shifted and he was simply waiting to see what I'd do about it. And 3 nights later, there was a soft knock on my bunkhouse door. Barely there, almost hesitant, and I was sitting on the edge of my cot shirtless with a book open on my lap that I hadn't touched in 20 minutes. And I opened the door and Wade was standing there in a plain grey t-shirt and old jeans. Hair damp like he'd just washed off, no work shirt, no Stetson, no armor, just real, and he nodded once and said, "Wasn't just a night for me." And that was all, those 5 words, and I stepped back and let him in without saying anything. And this time we didn't rush, we undressed each other piece by piece, not like strangers, not like men with a transaction between them, but like people finally admitting something out loud that they'd both known for weeks, every touch deliberate, every moment saying something words couldn't carry. And when he held my face in both hands, it said, "I see you." And when I pressed my forehead to his chest, it said, "I've been waiting." And when we lay down tangled in cotton sheets, with the last of the evening light coming through the dusty window, he wrapped his arm around me like he had absolutely no intention of letting go. And afterward his fingers drew lazy shapes across my lower back and mine curled into the hem of his shirt, because I wasn't ready for the night to end. And I knew then with complete and total certainty that this was not about paychecks. This was not about desperation. This was about him and me and the space we were finally making between us for something that had never been given enough room to exist before. And then the whispers started, because a ranch this size with bunkhouses this close does not have real privacy. And somebody saw Wade leaving my room before sunrise, and the morning after I walked into the mess hall like normal, grabbed my plate, poured my coffee, went to sit at the long table, and Tommy didn't look up. And Marco, who always nodded, kept his eyes on his food, and nobody said a word, not one word. But silence has a sound, and this one was deafening. And by lunch it wasn't just silence anymore, it was eyes cutting sideways when I walked by. It was laughter that stopped the moment I came around a corner. It was two ranch hands who suddenly needed to be on the complete opposite end of the property any time they saw Wade and me working near each other. And I felt every single glance like a needle, but Wade didn't flinch. He walked beside me the same as always, handed me tools, cracked dry jokes, corrected my grip on the halter rope like we were the only two people on the entire ranch. And if he noticed the shift in the air, he didn't let a single muscle in his face show it, though I saw the tightness in his jaw, and I saw the way he scanned the yard before we moved between stations. And the confrontation came 3 days later. I was brushing down a chestnut mare in the east barn when I heard boots moving fast and hard on the dirt, and turned just in time to see Wade shove Derek, big guy, mean streak wider than Texas, up against the stable wall hard enough that dust flew from the boards. And Wade said in a voice I had never heard from him before, low and dangerous and absolutely certain, "What did you just say?" And Derek's face was red and his jaw was set, and he said, "Just making conversation. Didn't know this place turned into a brothel. Didn't know the boss was taking his boys to." And Wade's fist slammed into the wood right beside Derek's head. Not a punch, a warning, but it shook the whole barn, and Wade said, "You want to keep talking, Derek, go ahead, but you won't be talking from this ranch." And Derek looked at me with disgust, so thick it had a texture, and said, "You're soft, both of you." And Wade let go of his shirt and said simply, "Get your things, you're done here," and Derek stormed out, and the barn went quiet, and Wade turned to me, chest still heaving, hands shaking slightly, and the first thing he said was, "You okay?" Not that felt good or he had it coming, just "You okay?" And that night I found him out by the corral in the dark, cigarette glowing, watching the horses move slow and peaceful in the moonlight, and I walked up and stood beside him and eventually asked why he'd risked it, why he'd gone after Derek like that, and he looked at me with a face that was calm now but tired in a way that went bone deep. And he said, "Because I ain't hiding anymore, and I don't want you to either." And something cracked open in my chest when he said that, because I had spent so many years making myself smaller, keeping my eyes pointed down, walking a perfectly straight line. And this man was standing in the open dark, refusing to apologize for a single thing about himself. And I stepped closer, and his shoulder brushed mine, and I kissed him right there in the open air with no shadows to hide in and no locked door between us and whoever might be watching. And I just leaned in and pressed my mouth to his soft and certain. And he didn't flinch, didn't glance around, didn't hesitate. He kissed me back slow and steady like he'd been waiting for me to meet him in the middle. And when we pulled apart, he rested his hand on my jaw, thumb brushing just under my cheekbone, and said, "You sure?" And I nodded, and for the first time in my entire life, I actually was. And then the end of my contract crept up like a thief. I'd signed on for 60 days, just enough to patch the hole in my finances and disappear the same quiet way I'd arrived. And I was in the bunkhouse staring at an empty duffel bag, trying to figure out how to fold a life back into itself, when the door opened without a knock and Wade stood there looking at me with that tight expression around his eyes, and said, "You planning on leaving without saying a word?" And I said I figured it'd be easier that way. And he stepped inside and closed the door and crossed his arms and said, "You done running?" And I told him the truth for the first time. I said, "I don't even know what I am. I don't have a label, I don't have a plan. I just needed work and you made it complicated." And he uncrossed his arms and stepped forward and said, "No, I made it real," and looked me straight in the eye and said, "I know what you are, you're the man I've been waiting for." And everything in me stopped, my hands, my breath. Every excuse I'd ever built stopped like a clock with a dead battery. And he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key on a leather strap, and told me about a cabin behind the hayfields, old one, used to be for visiting trainers, needed fixing up, but it had a porch and a stove and a view that went on forever. And he pressed that key into my palm and said, "It's yours if you want it." And I stared down at that key, feeling its weight like a question I didn't know if I was ready to answer, and I whispered, "I don't know if I can be what you think I am." And he brushed a knuckle along my jaw and said, "I don't want perfect. I want you here with me, not just at night, not just in the quiet." And I looked at this man who had been patient every time I ran, gentle every time fear took over, steady every single time I didn't know who I was, and I didn't say yes with words. I took his hand, and his fingers curled around mine, firm and warm and certain. And we walked out together past the horses and past the barn and past the edge of everything I used to be, and he showed me the cabin, small, 2 rooms, rusted tin roof, windows thick with years of dust, but the view opened wide to the valley, fields stretching gold in the setting sun, wind moving through the grass like a quiet song. And Wade slid his arm around my waist and said, "This is where we start." And I leaned into him and felt something I had never once felt in 30-something years on this earth. I felt like I had stopped running, and I felt like wherever I had landed was exactly where I was supposed to be, and that was 4 months ago. And now the mornings come easy. There's a rhythm to them I never thought I'd be allowed to have. I wake up before the sun breaks over the hills, and Wade's arm is always around me, heavy and warm, like he's still a little afraid I'll disappear if he loosens his grip. And I stay a minute longer than I need to, just breathing in the scent of him, pine soap and leather and the faintest trace of hay. And eventually I slip out and pull on one of his flannel shirts and start the coffee, because his kitchen is mine now too. I know where the mugs with chipped rims live. I know about the cinnamon he only pretends not to like. I know about the tin of sugar he labels salt to keep the other hands from stealing it. And I make breakfast while he pulls on jeans slow and buttons his shirt like he's in no hurry, watching me from across the room like I'm something he still can't quite believe showed up in his life. And we sit on the porch in the cold morning air with our coffee and watch the valley wake up, and we don't say much because we don't need to. And we had the neighbors over last weekend. Martha and Eugene, married 50 years, sharp as tacks and kind as anything. They brought pie and we made roast chicken. And at one point Martha asked how long we'd been roommates, and Wade set his hand on mine right there at the table and said, "We're together." Just like that, no pause, no joke, no apology, just fact. And Martha didn't flinch, and Eugene nodded and said, "Well, that's good. You're easier to talk to now, Wade." And we all laughed. And after they left, Wade stood by the door quiet for a moment and said, "You ever think we'd get this?" And I shook my head and said, "Not in this life." And his eyes went a little wet and his voice went soft, and he said, "Well, we got it now." And I thought about how it all started. How lost I was, how certain I was that this was just a pit stop, a paycheck, a temporary patch on a broken life, and how one man with a steady gaze and a slow voice and more patience than I deserved broke through every single wall I'd spent years constructing. He saw me when I didn't know how to see myself. He offered money, but what he was really offering was something I'd never been brave enough to reach for. And now I kiss him in the daylight, I wear his shirts. I fall asleep with his hand on my chest and wake up to the sound of his voice, rough and low and full of something I used to think wasn't meant for someone like me. And I'm not afraid anymore. I came here broke and scared and running from myself. And I found the one person who refused to let me keep running. And the question I keep thinking about, the one I want to leave you with, is this: what would you have done if love showed up in your life disguised as something else entirely? Something messy and complicated, and nothing like what you imagined. Would you have walked away? Or would you have been brave enough to stay and find out what it could become?